Good morning. I hope that you're doing well. Thank you for completing the midterm exam last week. I know that we're getting pretty close to the end of the quarter, and I would imagine that you all are feeling a little bit overwhelmed or at least pretty busy. So what I'd like to do is use this video as a chance to first debrief the midterm and go over some of the more challenging questions, get into a little bit more detail about the term paper rough draft. That's an essay due not this Friday, but the following Friday. And then finally, use some time to talk about the new chapter for Jant in order to prepare you for this week's quiz and activity. So let's start first with the midterm. Overall, people did a really good job on this exam. And by the end of the day today, I'll be posting feedback on your short essays and giving you your final grade that includes both the multiple choice and short essay portions of the assignment. In fact, people did really well on the multiple choice, averaging out in the kind of A-, B+ range for that portion of the assignment. So really good work there. So what I'd like to do is go through some of the more challenging questions, and if you would like me to go over any questions with you, either multiple choice or the short essay portion in more detail, I'd be happy to talk with you a little bit more about that and help to discuss some of these answers. So let's talk first about the beginning three questions. These questions were related to the different styles of deconstructing conflict. So the first question gets at forgiveness and reconciliation. So the Hawker-Wilmot Conflict Assessment Guide is the best way to understand an approach focused on forgiveness. It's very much trying to understand the guiding emotions and feelings of people in conflict, and so it was the best response to this question. Lenny, in question number 2, is understanding social realities. Social reality is a concept that comes in change-oriented conflict analysis. It suggests that for different people in conflict, their social reality or perception of the world and conflict resolution's ability to manage that world might look really different, making that the best approach here. And then finally, conflict regulation potential is a concept that comes up in Ware's conflict map. Ware's conflict map really tries to understand the different interests of different parties in a conflict. What does somebody want? And so this is the best answer to this question. So being able to contrast and define these different maps was an important way for you to address these first three questions. Again, there were a lot of questions that many people got correctly and did a great job on. In fact, a couple questions that everybody got right. So as we continue to kind of move on through some of these later questions, one of them that comes up here is the question true-false about single-issue non-numerical bargaining, right? So the idea here is that single-issue non-numerical bargaining is actually a tougher way to resolve conflict because oftentimes when people are debating an issue or trying to reach resolution on an issue that doesn't have hard-coded numbers to attach to it, people might have different views about what might be measured or what numbers to use. So for instance, if it's about reducing a nuclear arsenal, there might be different beliefs about how much we should reduce it, what would be considered safe, and so on. So in non-numerical bargaining, it's really important that you and the other person are able to define the terms and figure them out pretty well. Again, those were some of the more tricky questions, but I'm happy to go over any of the multiple choice questions that you'd like me to discuss with you in a little bit more detail. I want to talk now about the short essay portion and some of the ways that I assess the short essays in order to grade those assignments. So the first question is about Rob, who's interested in facilitating a study circle. This goes back to chapter 1 and the ideas of a study circle, including the online studies discussion that you used in class. So what makes an effective study circle includes a lot of different things. So a good response to this first part of the question is the idea that an effective study circle involves active communication among groups. It allows people to express disagreements freely, but that it does so in a way that avoids personal attacks. So if you talked about a study circle in terms of a broad discussion that allowed people to debate and engage on issues in a respectful way, you were doing a good job of answering this part of the question. As a facilitator, there's a really important component here that a facilitator needs to take on, and that's somebody who doesn't strongly express their own opinion or view on the topic, but instead creates a dialogue and an opportunity, such as prompting people to speak, creating and maintaining a respectful environment, and so on. So if you ever are managing a conflict situation on your own, this facilitator role is an especially important thing for you to take on. Lastly, in this first question, issues of culture and diversity are incredibly important. For instance, you might talk about in this question the ways that people in different cultures might be occupying space or speaking differently, so managing the time and space in the room that people might suck out to speak. To be sensitive to the needs of a diverse set of participants, it might be allowing people to speak or prompting people to speak from different backgrounds. It might be taking jargon or technical language that might be inaccessible to members of different cultures and breaking down that language in a way that's a little bit clearer and more straightforward. So that might be a way to address issues of culture. By the way, in general, in these short essay responses, what I was looking for were, first of all, did you show a knowledge of these terms, ideas, and concepts? And second of all, were you able to apply and use those in order to address the prompts fully? So I wasn't looking for perfect writing skills or grammar or spelling or anything like that. Instead, in terms of your ability to apply and use the concepts from the course. The second question is about groupthink. Remember that groupthink is a problem in things such as the Bay of Pigs invasion, where a larger group of people generally come to the same conclusions on issues, that dissenting or disagreeing views don't have the opportunity to be expressed, and it can lead to disastrous results because people aren't checking each other or giving each other the opportunity to really make sure that they've reached a good decision. So there's a lot of different examples of groupthink that could come up. Bay of Pigs, of course, has been one that's been brought up in the class as well as in your textbook. Some examples of groupthink might be public relations fails, so things such as advertisements, commercials, and so on that were put together or thought through very poorly. Other examples of groupthink, you might think about the sort of drawdown from Afghanistan, and regardless of your position on the topic, the issues that might have emerged and the ability to do that effectively. You could look at things such as failed political campaigns and so on. There's a lot of different examples here of groupthink. Symptoms of groupthink, right? So symptoms of groupthink might be an unquestioned belief in authority, the belief that the group is more moral or overall superior than other groups, and so on. Those might be some of the issues that might be identified. And steps to combat groupthink involve letting people play devil's advocate, letting people independently share or write down their thoughts before they become members of the group and participate, and allowing outside people to come into the group are other ways to address groupthink. Negotiation is something that we talked about shortly before the midterm exam. Remember that negotiation is working together with other parties to try to develop a common and agreed upon solution. So what makes it different from something such as coercion or mediation is that it doesn't have a third party or a person that is forcing you to make a choice. It's that the people in conflict are working together to reach a solution. An ethical negotiator means being honest about the terms, the things you want, and the boundaries that you might be having. So presenting something like an unrealistic price and going down from there might not be very ethical. So there's a lot of different types of bargaining that you might contrast with the third part of the question. That could be single issue bargaining that's either numerical or non-numerical, multiple interest bargaining, and so on. But I was just interested in better understanding how the role of ethics might play into those things. So for instance, in single issue non-numerical bargaining, a major ethical concern is that both people understand what it is that's being negotiated and have a common definition to work from. So that's an example of using an application well. And then the last question was related to deconstructing conflict. Again, going full circle to the three different models of deconstructing conflict. Resources available to deconstruct a conflict might include tangible evidence, something like a written document, witness reports, or a third party who has observed a situation, or self-reports, where a person in conflict is reflecting on the experience. Generally speaking, tangible evidence is the most reliable or useful way to manage and make sense of a conflict. Generally speaking, a self or witness report can have issues with false memory and things that are not entirely accurate. And then the point of deconstructing a conflict, well, past is prologue. By deconstructing and understanding a conflict, you can prevent the same conflict from happening again in the future. You can allow the parties to better understand one another. So those might be some of the practical benefits that can have. Again, those are some of the ways that you could have gone about responding to the short essay questions. I tried to keep them pretty open-ended and give you the chance to respond with your best knowledge in mind. So if you understood the terms and concepts and used them in ways that were meaningful and interesting, I think that you did a really good job on this assignment. And again, if there's questions about the midterm, please let me know. The next thing that I want to talk about is the term paper assignment that's due not this Friday, but the following Friday. You'll notice on Canvas that I've included both a rubric for this assignment that goes over how I'll be grading the assignment, as well as an example outline that goes over some of the ways that you could structure this essay. So this essay is about 2,000 pages in length, or about 4 pages or so, and I'm basically asking you to look at a case study in conflict management. A case study could take on a lot of different forms. For example, for this week's prompt, I'm asking you to look at an example of an anti-bullying campaign. That could be an example of conflict management and ways to address issues like bullying and aggression that could emerge. Another example, we can look to a lot of major foreign policy issues or negotiations. So we've talked about things such as the Bay of Pigs, but we can also look at things such as the recent Glasgow Agreement, the Paris Climate Accords, G7 or G8 summits, international trade agreements, and so on. These kind of multinational organizations, groups to get together on issues are examples of some larger scale issues of conflict management. We can also look at a lot of domestic policy, so ongoing negotiations about infrastructure and spending might be examples of conflict management. So there's a lot of sort of political and social topics, and other topics that might be interesting to you. So the history of wildlife management and conservation, including whether or not wolves are on the endangered species list, are some examples of utilizing conflict management skills to look at issues. But what I'm looking for is a case study or a conflict that has occurred or is still ongoing that involves different parties and involves different approaches. And what I'm looking for is for you to use some of the key ideas from the course in order to analyze and make sense of that conflict. So you're not arguing in favor of a position on the conflict. It's not an argumentative essay. It's instead an analytical essay. I'm asking you to explain what has happened or what is happening in this conflict using evidence from that conflict as well as evidence from the JAMP textbook. So for instance, maybe you're looking at the issue of the Iran nuclear deal, and you're concerned with the numerical bargaining that was being raised on the number of centrifuges that Iran possesses. So you could use this idea of single issue numerical bargaining and apply it to this conflict to understand the ways that the conflict is unfolding. So in other words, a case study, again, is this example. It's really tangible and clear that helps us understand a conflict that's happening. So you can include an introduction that establishes this case study, use rich details from this case study where you're able to apply it to issues in conflict management, and then to summarize your key points at the end of the essay. You can use APA, MLA, or Chicago style. Make sure to include both in-text citations and a works cited list. Please make sure to include both of those whenever you're quoting or citing outside material. Otherwise, right, it would be considered plagiarism. Please don't plagiarize. I run each of these assignments through a Turnitin.com checker, so please make sure that it's original content for this course, that it's not a paper that you've already used for a different course. Please also make sure that you're not pulling information from other sources without directly quoting or citing them. Again, I'm happy to look at rough drafts, outlines, and anything else that you'd like to send me to help you to prepare for this assignment. I ask that in order to ensure that I can turn feedback to you on time, that the kind of cutoff for you to do so is a week from Wednesday. So if you can use time between now and then to send me your draft or ideas, please do so. One other thing I wanted to bring up is that you should have already turned in your reflection for your online study discussion. I will be returning feedback for you on that assignment by the end of this week. So that'll be available for you to help understand how that assignment went down. So let's finally pivot and talk about some of the new content for Chapter 6 of JAMP. This chapter gets into the role of anger, aggression, and bullying. And as I mentioned before, this week's activity is asking you to look at an example of an anti-bullying campaign to understand some of these steps in action. So there, of course, are major issues that are happening here with anger. Right? Anger is an emotion where we perceive injustice or something that's happening unfairly, and we feel really strongly for that. We tend to seize up, we tend to get a very fight or flight type of response that makes us feel not always very happy about conflict. So it's a question of how we're able to deal with and address the conflict that might happen. For instance, we might feel what's called flooding, where we just have this rush of emotions, this anger, where we're just kind of overwhelmed with anger or frustration toward other people. So there's a lot of different ways that we might deal with and address the anger that we have. Anger management, of course, is an idea that's brought up that suggests that we're able to develop a set of steps for dealing with conflict. There's also what's known as the XYZ formula, which says when you do X in situation Y, I feel Z. When you interrupt me in the middle of a sentence, I feel frustrated because I can't get my idea together. That's a way to break down your anger in a more constructive manner. Additionally, things such as engaged Buddhism have their own steps of thinking about managing conflict too. I suffer and I want you to know it. I'm doing my best and I need your help are some of the guiding principles of this type of approach. So when it comes to thinking about anger and aggression, there's what we can sort of categorize as 4 core aggressive traits. That can include assertiveness, right, where you're able to argue or defend on behalf of your position. This is constructive, it's good. By asserting yourself, you're able to establish your own needs and interests. For instance, saying something like, hey, we were going around and sharing each other's names, but you didn't get to me. Can I share my name? That's a way of advocating for yourself. Argumentativeness is where you're disagreeing with people on the issues rather than the people. So one of the major things that happens in conflict is an ad hominem attack, where you're calling somebody names or using personal attacks against them. Argumentativeness suggests that instead, no, it's the issues and topics. We can be great friends, but we can have these heated or interesting discussions that don't seep over to impacting our own relationship. So disagreeing about the issues rather than the person is argumentativeness. Hostility is a destructive trait because hostility is much more focused on disliking somebody and trying to destroy them. Right? So it's oftentimes the idea of revenge or retaliation, that we're trying to really break somebody down. And aggressiveness is using force. It can be physical force, it can be manipulation or abuse and so on in an attempt to destroy the other person in some capacity. So a constructive approach is not trying to attack the person, but in trying to engage with the person. Whereas a destructive approach is one that is trying to destroy what we see as the threat. So there's also different approaches to argumentativeness that different people have. That can be both the degree to which people are comfortable engaging in a conflict and how much they might seek that conflict out. So some people really dislike conflict, but also really try to avoid it whenever they can under a low argumentative model. So there's a few different approaches here to understand that people think about conflict in very different ways. Additionally, there's this idea of verbal aggressiveness, right? So where you can attack the competence, the character, you can use things such as threats and so on to be verbally hurtful towards somebody else. It doesn't always lead to direct violence, but it can oftentimes do so, particularly in terms of aggravating, right? Where oftentimes we see something like an aggravated assault, where people are engaged in violence because people use what they refer to as, quote, fighting words to initiate this conflict. Another issue, of course, is this idea of bullying. And bullying is distinct from other forms of aggression or violence for 2 key reasons. First of all, there is an imbalance between the perpetrator and the target. Oftentimes, the perpetrator has some level of power or authority or influence. If you think about like bullying as it's depicted in a lot of middle or high school shows, it's typically a bully that's this big, strong person that's picking on a smaller person in the group. So there's a power imbalance there. And the second thing in bullying is that it's repetitive. The bully keeps coming by and keeps attacking the same person over and over. It's not a one-off thing. And of course, bullying is an incredible problem. Not only does bullying tend to target people from diverse and non-dominant groups, but things such as school bullying have been targeted through things such as campaigns. Bullying can contribute to things such as taking one's own life, self-harm, and so on. For instance, the Tyler Clementi example was one case in which cyberbullying was targeted on the basis of somebody's sexual orientation. So cyberbullying is a major issue in a way that issues surrounding bullying have definitely pivoted. There's also a lot of different ways to address bullying. In fact, one of the best ways is to change the environment, to, for instance, force a bully into a different school or a different classroom where they're no longer able to engage in that type of aggression. We can also do a variety of tactics to address bullying that happens in things like the workplace. So workplace bullying can often be related to power relationships, like a supervisor that's harassing an employee, or the way that things such as race and gender can play into this as well. So there's a lot of different ways to address bullying in different forms, such as leaving the situation through exodus, using a collective voice or a sort of shared solidarity where members of the group speak out against the bullying that's happened, sort of subversive disobedience where the group members kind of subtly work against the person that's bullying them, and so on. So there's a lot of different approaches that can be utilized here to help with bullying. So in order to kind of put this chapter together, we understand that there's a lot of different types of anger, aggression, and bullying that might be expressed by different groups. That while feeling anger and so on is a normal human emotion, the way that we choose to act on that and interact with other people is definitely something that we can choose to modify and control in order to improve our conflict management skills. So those are the main things to know for this week. You're welcome to use this chapter in order to take the quiz as well as the Chapter 6 activity. Remember that your midterm grades will be up by the end of the day today. And also remember that you will be turning in your term essay that has the rubric and outline available for you a week from this Friday. Have a great week. Let me know if you have any questions or things that I can do to support you. And I will talk to you all again next week.